I'm going to share some insights through some international trips very recently. And in general, I'll just sum it up before I begin and say it's very positive. Very positive in that through the efforts of the KDA, Commissioner Quarles, the staff at the KDA, Kentucky is poised to literally be a major player on a global scale for industrial hemp. That's an industry. And almost without exception, everywhere I visit, and we get to talking about, well, how do you do this? And how do you do that? Kentucky, because of the regulations and legislation and administration we have in place, is in a wonderful, wonderful position to be very competitive. So we wouldn't have what we have without the legislation, regulation, and administration of the program. So we're very, very lucky that we have that here in Kentucky. So I'm going to talk about 3 trips that I've taken recently. The first one through my relationship with Tyler, who just spoke, to Uruguay. So let me ask you, when I say Uruguay, what do you think of? I'm sorry? Llamas, okay. Yeah, alpacas. Warm weather, okay.
Legal cannabis?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, I'll just go ahead and talk about that real quick. So Uruguay is the only nation in the entire world, that has fully legal cannabis. Now, you can go to Amsterdam, been there. I won't say done that, but I've been there. And, you know, it's not legal there, but it's overlooked. Uruguay has a fully legal cannabis industry, and it's very structured. You can go to the drugstore and buy some if you choose to. You can grow your own. Clearly, there's a limit. You know, you can't just grow acres and acres, but you grow whatever you want. Or you can join a cannabis club, a social club. We visited one. They grow their own. They, you know, people just sit around and smoke. So it's totally legal in Uruguay, and that's very different than any other place that I've ever visited. So it does add an advantage, potentially at least, to their hemp industry, right? But the point I want to make is that I'll share my vision, or what I thought of Uruguay before I went there. So probably not highly developed, okay, generally speaking. You know, economically, not really all that great. That's not the case at all. It's a highly, I'll just say, European type country. All the folks that live and work there are of European descent, most of them, of course. And it's not at all what I expected it to be. And very, very forward-thinking, clearly, regarding cannabis. And so they're excited about their industry. So if you don't know where Uruguay is, it's between Brazil and Argentina. So it's a little country about the size of landmass of Florida. So not a great big giant country. And it's about the same latitude as northern Georgia. So not a whole lot different climate, or at least latitude, day length, than what we have here, which of course is always important. One really cool thing about their agriculture, they're heavily based in corn and beans, like Tyler was talking. They have a large beef industry, like many countries in South America have, but they have this pulpwood industry too. So almost all these grain farms, this is a grain crop in front of us here, they'll have 1 hectare of a pulp crop. And it's almost like our CRP program in the United States. The government pays the farmers to grow this pulp crop for a period of time. And we're not talking about this is just going down the road, so it's not a great photo. We're not talking about saw logs, right? We're not talking about lumber for building or whatever. It's for pulp. And I thought that was very, very interesting. And that's a very successful program there. But by far, most of their efforts are in grain. They're grain production, corn and beans. And so I would offer, like Tyler was mentioning a moment ago, that the potential is very high for Uruguay to participate on a global scale. They do now participate on a global scale with corn and soybeans. So there's really no reason to think that they can't, especially with their very moderate regulatory environment, that they couldn't compete very well with industrial hemp. And I expect they probably will. We visited several large grain farms, and they're highly productive lands, not unlike the central United States. So they have the agronomic expertise, they have the infrastructure, the equipment. They only need to get started. And so that's why we were invited there, was to help a couple of what I would call leading business people in that part of the world maybe get started with their hemp industry. And so I expect you'll hear more from them in the not too distant future. I will note that, I mean, these hedges, they're just really cool. They're strategically placed, again, very European, right? You see that in Europe, a lot of places, and you see it here in Uruguay too. They do have some big-ass lizards. I mean, if that thing were on its hind legs coming in your direction, you'd be looking for a treat or something, I believe. So a little bit different in that regard, relative to what goes on here. Okay, I'm going to move on to some experiences very recently in Australia. I attended the National Australian Hemp Conference, and this is a photograph of the participants, and they probably had about 200 people, not a whole lot more than are sitting in this room, right? Not a whole lot more than are sitting in this room for a state level hemp industry thing. So if that's any indication at all where Kentucky stands on a global scale, participation in the local conference, I mean, that says a lot, right? The people that are active or interested in the industry present here today, and there's the one in Australia. It was largely attended by Australians, a few New Zealanders. I'll talk more about New Zealand. There were a few international guests, myself being one. You may recognize Jeff Kostick, who's the agronomist with Hemp Genetics International. HGI has a large positive presence in Kentucky. So I've known Jeff actually since 2015. He's a Canadian agronomist and invited me to his research farm more than one occasion. I've learned so much from Jeff, and it was great to spend some time with him in Australia. The normal, the normal stuff, what stuff we all see at all hemp conferences, that's how to harvest, how to grow, the same old song and dance. And I don't mean to sound trite, but there's just not a lot of new information right now. So you generally end up seeing a lot of the same stuff no matter where you go. So one of the best parts of this trip, and hemp-centric parts of this trip, was a little short flight to Tasmania. And we visited both the production farm, hemp production farm, and the university research farm, which was clearly right up my alley. I love that, a lot of fun, in Tasmania. Again, the hedges, these countries are very, very heavily influenced by Europe and European practices and protocols, and we just don't have that here, even in places where it would probably serve a great purpose. So agriculture in Tasmania, pretty much the same, heavily based in livestock, in particular beef, and also grain, corn and soybeans, just like we see here. Now, Tasmania, let's see, let me make sure I get this right. They are about the same latitude as Chicago, if I'm not mistaken. About the same latitude as Chicago. Why do I keep saying that? Who cares? That has everything in the world to do with day length. That is day length, defines day length. So it actually goes a long way to defining their agronomic protocols for hemp production, just like our latitude in Lexington or Kentucky does as well. So there's a quick photo of an irrigated hemp grain crop in Tasmania, a pretty good looking crop. So irrigation's different in that part of the world. They're encouraging irrigation to increase yields, and so there's a lot of government support for that type of activity. Unlike here, where we pretty much shoot each other over water rights, it's not quite the issue as far as finding water, and the government is very, very supportive of promoting irrigation to increase yields, which increases GDP, right? So that's why the government is happy to do that. They do suffer some of the same problems that we're all familiar with. I think Nicole, I've seen Nicole here. Are you Nicole? Yeah, hi Nicole. Our plant pathologist in the UK doing a lot of work with hemp diseases. They do have a sclerotinia problem there that's very well known and described in Canada. We see it a little bit here, but in general, we're not talking about the giant reductions in yield, but it's a real thing and something that we probably need to pay close attention to. They also had a reasonably serious insect problem. Are there any entomologists in the room? No? Well, so I don't remember the name of this thing, so I won't be embarrassed by trying to figure that out. A little caterpillar that burrows into the stem and kills the plant above the point that it burrows. So that could be clearly pretty serious too. But again, at least in the case of this crop, we're not talking about huge reductions in yield. So I would guess that to be at 1,000 pounds per acre or better when push comes to shove. Okay, next stop was the University Research Farm, which again was just a huge amount of fun. I mean, that's what we do, right? So it's a lot of fun to visit a totally different country, part of the world, and see how that goes. So just quickly, that's the entrance road into their farm, these two fields on either side. So if you look at this little field, this brown stuff, that's what it was. Can you identify that? I'm sorry? Cotton. No? Opium poppies. Opium poppies. So somebody in UK pharmacy, when I asked, told me that almost all of the opium in the United States, and I'm talking about legal opium, not heroin, comes from Turkey. Comes from Turkey, which to me was always just a really weird thing. Why wouldn't we grow our own, have control over the crop under highly managed conditions, right? You just don't plant poppies everywhere. But it's actually not the case. A great deal of the legal opiate medications come from Tasmania. They have a huge opium poppy production system in that country. Highly regulated, clearly. I mean, they literally know the moment you plant, they literally know the moment you harvest. They count plants. It's a highly, highly regulated thing. But I didn't know that, so I learned that. I've never done that in my whole life, right? I've held an opium poppy and all the seeds, yeah. So just a very, very odd experience. But that was not the main purpose of our trip. To them it's just another day. They were probably about how silly we were to go on and on about, you grow poppies here. But they also had an excellent hemp research program. This is Dr. Mark Osanova, the agronomist there, and another one of his colleagues and a graduate student. And we had a great visit. They were doing things similar to what Dr. Woosley talked about. Nitrogen rates, nitrogen application timings, and so forth. And they've been growing hemp in Australia for a long time. This is not new, right? And they're just still working on some of this introductory stuff. So again, an indication of where Kentucky is relative to the rest of the world, and I would say in a very, very positive way, very positive indeed. We did see some really cool stuff there, and I'll go ahead and note that we've begun an email conversation. It's not practical to have telephone conversations very well with that part of the world, but or Zoom or whatever presentations. We almost certainly will have a strong, strong collaborative effort with folks in Tasmania regarding some research efforts. So probably, I didn't know this, but they tell me that there's an effect on potato yield if you grow in the southern hemisphere versus the northern hemisphere. And I don't know why that is, or really even what the effect is, but we're going to see if there's any effect on him as well, or any other that just have to yield. But so we'll do some fun stuff and hopefully some useful stuff too. All right, now last stop, New Zealand. Absolutely one of the, in my opinion, most beautiful countries on the whole planet. It is absolutely just as green as you probably imagine. If you've seen those, what are those movies? Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah, where they've got the hobbits and all that. We didn't go to that part and actually see that. I can well imagine, a bunch of hobbits running around. It's green. It's a beautiful, beautiful country. The people were so wonderful. Our host for the hemp portion of that trip was the Midlands Seed Company, and I would offer they have an extremely interesting business model. They are a seed company, so they started out and have made a very, very successful business out of seed production and seed sales to farmers. So, just seeds, so corn seed, whatever, grass seed, they're big in grass seed for forages. Agriculture in New Zealand is heavily, heavily dairy-based. I couldn't believe all the dairy cattle we saw on both the North and South Islands of New Zealand. It's amazing how much their dairy production is. Over 70% of that is exported directly to China. So it's a very, very profitable enterprise, the dairy business in New Zealand. They even such that they take 3 months off every year, put their cows on dry lot, actually send them to different farms and let somebody else manage them for 3 months. And I don't know what you know about dairy in the United States or Kentucky. Dairy farmers milk cattle 365 days a year with no exceptions. You can't skip milking. You know, it's not acceptable. It's bad for the cattle. So a totally different business model in New Zealand for dairy than in the U.S. And I would offer a very positive difference, generally speaking. But that being the case, if they have all the cattle and all the dairy cattle, then it's a forage country. You almost see no grain production or very little grain production in New Zealand relative to other places in the world, certainly including Kentucky. So hay, forage for grazing, but hay production is huge. Again, the government is all about exporting stuff to China, so they're supporting irrigation of hay production. They center pivots for farmers for hay production. I mean, how much irrigated hay is in Kentucky? Yeah, very little to almost none. Right, so just a very, very different way of looking at things and doing business than what we're accustomed to here. So let's see. Ashburton on the southern island, the South Island, is about the same latitude as Orlando. Okay, Orlando. So a little bit closer to the equator, but still kind of weird that, you know, trees like that growing out in the front yard. And this is at the end of their summer when we were there just about 3 weeks ago. You know, they're island nations, and so their climates are very moderate because of their islands. That Tasmania, they don't have extremes in either direction. Altitude is what defines how warm or cold you are, not you know, where the low pressures and stuff come. It's a totally different way of looking at weather than what we're accustomed to. Again, just a beautiful place that lights could be down a little bit. But again, it's largely a forage production system. You know, sheep are literally on fire there as far as agricultural commodity. There are just bazillions of sheep in New Zealand. They're everywhere, they're absolutely everywhere. And they're for both. They're for wool, but they're also lambs for meat. I didn't know this, but you don't really, I shouldn't say that. It's less common to eat or kill an adult sheep for meat. They're almost all lambs. And I guess that's not a whole lot different than beef cattle in the U.S. You know, we don't let cows get really old and then necessarily harvest them for meat, but they definitely don't do that for sheep. They definitely eat more lambs. But again, a big forage production area. Our host here was Jo Townsend, so she's an agronomist with the Midlands Company. She took us to 3 different production farms. We didn't have a chance to visit her research farm. We ran out of time asking too many questions everywhere we were. But this is another situation where these folks have been growing hemp for a while. This is not new, okay? I don't know exactly how long, but like 10 plus years. So different regulations that we have. Another great example of, wow, I wish we could do that, what we're doing in Kentucky. And so very different, but an older industry than what we have here. Sclerotinia again, Nicole. So saw it on both of those islands, and it doesn't show up all that great. There's a sclerotia and the seed head there, so easy to diagnose. And again, it's present, but not a deal breaker. You know, it's not killing yield to the point where farmers are asking or begging to spray fungicides. But man, they've got some production issues there. I mean, again, this has been going on for some time now. So their latitude's a little bit different, and they get some pretty daggone tall plants by the time it makes a grain crop. We all know that that's highly variety specific, right? It depends on the latitude of origin of the variety that you're trying to grow, how tall it will be before day length and sites flowering. And they today are using a lot of Canadian lines, right? So 40 whatever degrees, 40, I should know that, 41 degrees, I think, maybe 43 degrees. So, you know, that's not a whole lot different than Milwaukee or something, right? So they're close to Canada. But these Canadian lines that they're growing are getting awful tall before they're ready to combine. And I mean, you can see how tall I am. There's the residual straw after they were attempting to combine. It's a lot of biomass. It's a lot of biomass, and it's not easy to deal with that. It's not a simple thing. The equipment engineered for corn and beans and wheat in particular is not conducive to running or dealing with all that biomass. And is Tom Hutchins here today? No? Okay. I've said this a million times, and I said it here. Matter of fact, on this trip, Tom provided this quote and his permission for me to use it. They grew it for rope for a reason, right? When it gets wrapped around things in combines where it doesn't belong, it's a problem. It's a serious, serious problem. So efficiency of harvest is a big, big expense that Tyler was talking about a moment ago. So even industries that are far advanced in time relative to ours haven't figured all this out yet. So it's not just a simple thing. Now you can see where we are relative to the crop that has not been harvested yet. That's a lot of biomass to run through a combine. But they can't help it, right? The crop's that big. They wish that it weren't. I thought I had a slide that Joe was trying to point out. Yeah, there she is. I sure would prefer to be about this tall, than not that tall. It's a very, very serious issue. So one that we're working on, they're using standard combines. Talk to JT Workman. He's up next, I think. If anybody can figure it out, JT probably will. But they are using just standard combines. It does get wrapped around, but it doesn't belong around, and it is a serious issue. Somebody asked me this morning about birds. Are birds a problem? They're a serious enough problem there that they have cannons around the perimeter of their production fields. So that's another expense that Tyler hasn't accounted for, but propane cannons around the perimeter of the field. So every once in a while it explodes. They warned us if it does, it's okay, but just to scare the birds off. They'll leave for a few minutes and then they come back and then it explodes again. It's just a constant thing. In our research, we actually net, Patrick's in the room somewhere. Yeah, we put nets over our research plots because birds will absolutely destroy grain yields on plot scale production. So we have to cover them with plastic nets to keep the birds out. So, dove hunters? Got any dove hunters in the room? A couple? It's the best dove crop on the planet. They love it. Them and many other birds. So something to consider. Okay, so that's not hemp related, but it's karma related, right? Yeah, so we all connect to art, right? We all have our personal preferences as to I connected with those guys. I could hang around with those guys, I think, for a good afternoon and probably enjoy myself immensely. That's at the Sydney Museum of Modern Art in Sydney, Australia. So a little bit of a global perspective. Again, I'm going to reiterate that we in Kentucky are in excellent condition to be world players in this industry. And I'll just finish by stating that pretty darn excited about the federal legislation and the potential for hemp to become a quote-unquote legal crop. I'm not a business guy. I'm an agronomist. I grow things. We have several prominent, successful business people in this room. But what I do know is that even though I tend to be rather conservative in my investments, there's no way in the world that I would bet my retirement on the hemp industry today, because unfortunately the DEA or whatever, the federal government, could shut it down tomorrow. They're absolutely within their right today to do that. So I don't think that's going to happen. I'm not saying that, but it prohibits investment in infrastructure. And you can agree with this or not, but I think in 2017, Kentucky pretty much met the demand for hemp products that our infrastructure capacity could support. And so without more infrastructure and processing, we're pretty much there. I mean, that's not 100% accurate, but that's a big reason there weren't more acres last year. There's nowhere to sell it. And that's because there's nowhere to process it. So as investments in infrastructure and processing increase, demand increases for farmers, production increases. And I think that's exactly what we're going to see in 2018. And I'm excited about the potential. If it's no longer a quote-unquote illegal crop, investors will be far more likely to give hemp a good hard look as a new opportunity in that realm or in that space. So I'm very, very excited about that.